Now beginning Story 1, The Golden City, Baghdad at Dawn. You are standing at the edge of the Tigris River, sometime around the year 762. The air is thick with dust and the faint, bitter scent of wet clay. Men in linen tunics haul stone and mortar, their movements slow and repetitive under the sun. There is no city here yet, only a vision and a name whispered in the court of the new Abbasid Caliph, Baghdad, the city of peace. When Al-Mansur, the second Abbasid Caliph and grandfather of Harun al-Rashid, ordered this city to be built, it was not meant merely as a residence. It was to be a statement, the center of the world, drawn with mathematical precision, built to reflect both divine order and imperial control. The circular plan, a perfect ring of symmetry, was more than aesthetic. It was ideology rendered in brick and earth. The architects, Naubak the Persian and Mashallah the astrologer, were chosen not only for their skill but for their mastery of omens. They selected the hour of foundation according to the stars, ensuring the city's destiny would be prosperous and eternal. Baghdad's design began as a circle 2,000 meters across, divided into 4 gates facing the cardinal directions: the Gate of Kufa, the Gate of Basra, the Gate of Khurasan, and the Gate of Syria. Through these, the world would flow caravans from India, embassies from China, and scholars from every corner of the caliphate. Each wall was raised with almost ceremonial monotony. Layers of mud brick, dried and stacked, then baked in kilns along the riverbanks. The Abbasid administration recorded every expense down to the last dirham of wages paid to bricklayers and the number of donkeys used to carry stone. To build an empire, one first must measure it, count it, and document it. The bureaucrats kept their ledgers as carefully as the masons set their stones. As weeks turned into months, Baghdad began to rise from the dust. The round city became the caliph's idea of paradise on earth, a physical embodiment of order. At its center stood the Golden Gate Palace, where the caliph would sit, surrounded by 4 symmetrically placed streets leading outward, like the spokes of a wheel. In the very middle was the great mosque, its dome echoing the heavens, while at its heart the caliph would pray, his face turned toward Mecca, his city radiating outward like ripples from a divine command. And yet the calm precision of its plan hid a reality far less serene. The workers were tired, the taxes were heavy, and the materials scarce. Grain prices rose in the nearby villages. The Euphrates and Tigris both flooded and receded unpredictably. Even in the city of peace, there was no peace for those who built it. Still, the foundations were laid meticulously, bureaucratically, and obsessively. It was said that the caliph himself would ride his horse through the construction site, inspecting every brick, demanding perfection in the curve of a wall. The people whispered that he had built Baghdad not just to house his court, but to escape the chaos of Kufa and Damascus, where rebellion lingered like an old illness. Baghdad was meant to be immune to that, a city too new, too perfect, too calculated for disorder. Over time, as markets opened and homes filled, Baghdad's rhythm settled into one of quiet productivity. Early mornings along the river saw barges of timber arriving from the north. By midday, the bazaars filled with the smell of sesame oil and date syrup, and the sound of coppersmiths hammering pots in rhythmic precision. At dusk, call to prayer echoed through alleys built too narrow for horses, where merchants closed their stalls and children chased each other through the dust. It was not glamorous, it was not even peaceful really, but it was ordered, and that order was something the Abbasids worshipped almost as much as God. Behind that order was bureaucracy, the quiet machinery that made empires function. Thousands of scribes copied, stamped, and stored documents detailing every grain shipment, every tax collected from distant provinces, every horse purchased for the army. They sat in dim offices by the river, where ink pots were replenished daily and parchment grew scarce. The smell of damp reeds and ink hung in the air. Some of these scribes would live their entire lives without seeing the caliph whose orders they obeyed. But without them, there would be no empire, no Baghdad, and no golden age. By the time Harun al-Rashid was born 12 years after Baghdad's foundation, the city had already become a living organism. Its circular walls enclosed markets, mosques, schools, and palaces. Each layer of administration radiated outward like rings of influence. It was a city designed for governance, not freedom, a place where everything had its place, from the caliph's throne to the beggar's bowl. And yet Baghdad's perfection was fragile. It depended on paper, on order, and on obedience, things more delicate than stone. The first cracks appeared not in its walls but in its records: lost ledgers, unpaid soldiers, missing taxes. Small mistakes in the bureaucracy were like unseen termites gnawing at the base of an empire, but no one noticed yet. For now the city still gleamed, and its founder's dream remained intact. Harun al-Rashid would inherit not the building of Baghdad, but the task of keeping it alive, a far more subtle and wearying challenge. The city would grow restless under him, expanding beyond its perfect circle, overflowing its own boundaries, becoming a world unto itself. But that is a story for another night. For now, imagine the sound of the Tigris at dusk, the steady pulse of the city settling into its new rhythm. The empire has found its center, and the world turns toward Baghdad. Yet, one must wonder, can any city built to reflect divine order truly survive the imperfections of men who inhabit it? The round city had been built, its gates named, its walls patrolled. Baghdad was no longer a blueprint or vision, it was a breathing machine. But a city does not survive on architecture. It survives on administration, on the patient labor of those who copied, filed, taxed, and counted, and on the thin line between surplus and starvation. In the heart of this machine sat the Diwan, the administrative engine of the Abbasid state. While the Caliph lived at its center, cloaked in gold and protected by silence, the real work of empire was carried out by unseen hands, the scribes. Not warriors, not poets, not heroes, just men with stained fingers, hunched backs, and eyes tired from reading ink on parchment by the fading light of oil lamps. They copied every transaction, every letter from a provincial governor, every land grant or confiscation. They calculated taxes not only on land but on water rights, livestock, caravans, and even orchards. A lemon tree in Samarkand could be taxed if it produced enough fruit. Nothing escaped the reach of the Diwan, no province, no merchant, no beggar who climbed the economic ladder and found himself subject to scrutiny. And then there was the grain, always the grain. More than gold or silk or even oil, grain determined the fate of Baghdad. Wheat arrived from the fertile Sawad region to the south, where irrigation canals built centuries before by Persians still functioned, barely. Every month, officials measured the city's reserves. If grain prices rose too sharply, riots followed. If they fell too low, farmers revolted. The delicate act of feeding the capital involved a quiet symphony of boatmen, granary scribes, tax inspectors, and street vendors, all trying to survive, and all being watched. To walk through Baghdad in the time of Harun al-Rashid was to pass unseen through this system. You would see mud brick homes, their windows barred not for fear of crime but for modesty. Behind them, women prepared bread in tandoor ovens sunk into courtyards. Chickens clucked in corners. Children fetched water in clay jugs from neighborhood wells. In the market, merchants shouted prices in a dozen languages: Persian, Syriac, Arabic, Greek. Slaves carried goods on their backs. Not all were bound in chains. Many were scribes, cooks, or tutors, captives of war now woven into urban life. If you looked closely, you would see the hierarchy that structured everything. A street cleaner knew to bow as a tax official passed. A merchant knew which inspector could be bribed and which could not. At the top, just beneath the Caliph, was the vizier, the voice of authority in daily matters. During Harun's reign, that role would famously be held by the Barmakids, a Persian family who rose from Buddhist origins to become stewards of an Islamic empire. But we are not there yet. We are still in the time of routines. Every Friday, the khutbah sermon was given in the great mosque, always including the name of the Caliph, reaffirming his legitimacy. In every corner of the caliphate from Morocco to Central Asia, the same name was heard: even in places where no official had ever set foot. Power, after all, was maintained not only by force but by repetition. Back in Baghdad, guilds began to form groups of craftsmen who controlled trade secrets. Glassblowers, tanners, weavers, and perfumers. They trained their sons, passed their shops down through generations, and sometimes settled disputes without involving the courts. Even in this early age, Baghdad was already organizing itself into a layered economy. And then there were the market's labyrinths of trade and gossip. The smell of sandalwood, cumin, and rotting fish competed in narrow alleys. Bargaining was a ritual. Sellers exaggerated. Buyers complained. Inspectors from the Hisba, the Market Enforcement Office, patrolled to ensure fairness. A butcher caught cheating on weight could be publicly shamed, fined, or even flogged. Not for morality, but for stability. Prices had to be trusted. In times of famine or instability, people didn't blame God. They blamed the Caliph. Food was central to the social contract. Every morning, Baghdad's ovens produced thousands of loaves of bread subsidized by the state for the poorest. These loaves were plain, unleavened, and stamped with the seal of the local bakers' guild. It was said that if the bread stopped arriving, the city would burn by nightfall. And so the city ran not on stories or swords, but on ledgers. In one small room near the Tigris, 3 scribes might spend an entire day calculating the tax returns from Wasit province. One would read aloud from a scroll. Another would check the math. The third, usually the senior, would stamp it with the official seal and tie it with colored string. The document would be copied in triplicate, one for the local diwan, one for the governor, and one to be stored in Baghdad's Beit al-Mal, the treasury archives. If one of those scrolls went missing, if a scribe made a careless error, if a seal was misplaced, an entire province might go underfunded, an army unpaid, a rebellion ignited. This is the side of empire that rarely makes it into epic poetry. There were no heroes here, only margins of error. Even the Caliph depended on this system. Harun al-Rashid, born into privilege, surrounded by poets and guards, could not act without his vizier, and his vizier could not act without scribes. A single policy such as lowering grain taxes in a drought year would require weeks of documentation, calculation, and distribution across the empire. The bureaucracy was so vast that it developed its own language, full of abbreviations and symbolic shorthand. A scribe from Khurasan might write a different character for paid in full than one from Egypt, leading to confusion and corruption. Some inspectors deliberately left documents vague, allowing interpretation. Others carved their reputations on ruthless precision. As Baghdad grew, so too did its dependencies. Water had to be channeled. Bridges had to be repaired. The city began overflowing the round city's original walls. New suburbs formed: Kark, the merchants' quarter, Rusafa across the Tigris for the military elite. These suburbs were not planned like the core. They grew organically, disorderly, like vines beyond a trellis. Still, the city functioned, because behind it was a network of tired, ink-stained men, too boring to be remembered by name, who made the empire work. Harun al-Rashid, even as a boy, would have grown up surrounded by this machinery. His tutors were former bureaucrats. His playmates were sons of ministers. He learned early that the caliph's throne was not a place of majesty, but a pivot point between countless tensions: tribal, economic, religious, administrative. By the time he became caliph in 786, at the age of 20, he had inherited not a kingdom of leisure, but a job. And the city, too, was now more than a capital. It was a symbol. Foreign envoys, especially from the Chinese Tang court and the Frankish court of Charlemagne, would arrive in Baghdad to marvel at its sophistication. They saw the palaces, the gardens, the libraries, but not the gears turning underneath. You, though, now know better. It wasn't the marble that kept Baghdad standing. It was paper. Fragile, ink-smeared, mold-prone paper, and the people who wrote on it. But if everything depends on paper, and people, what happens when the people grow ambitious, or when the paper lies. Baghdad was shining, prosperous, orderly at least from the outside. At the height of Harun al-Rashid's reign, travelers described the city in reverent tones. It had canals flowing with clean water, wide streets lit by oil lamps, and libraries stacked with the translated wisdom of Greece, Persia, and India. Markets teemed with goods from 3 continents. The call to prayer floated above the city 5 times each day, a reminder that despite the noise and commerce, Baghdad still bowed toward God. But beneath this polished surface, the city, like all great capitals, began to buckle under the weight of its own brilliance. Harun himself was a man of contrasts. By day, he was a ruler of rituals, seated under golden awnings, issuing decrees, receiving ambassadors, inspecting ledgers. By night, stories claim he walked the streets in disguise, observing his people, testing the honesty of merchants, seeking the pulse of his city. Whether those tales are myth or memory, they reflect a truth. Harun saw Baghdad not just as a city to govern, but a body to diagnose. And the symptoms were becoming clear. The first cracks appeared in the very foundation of the empire, the bureaucracy. As the empire expanded, so too did the number of scribes, inspectors, and tax collectors. But expansion did not equal cohesion. Different provinces used different coinage, different units of land, different calendars. To keep records consistent required not only diligence, but trust, and trust was beginning to erode. Corruption, once isolated, became systemic. It began small. A scribe overreports the cost of grain shipment and keeps the difference. A tax collector loses a ledger. A governor delays payment to the treasury, using the surplus to build a private villa. The empire, reliant on honest record-keeping, found itself tangled in half-truths and manipulated figures. Whole districts were uncounted. Inventories vanished. Harun responded with audits, dismissals, and reforms. He empowered his vizier Yahya al-Barmaki to root out corruption and streamline tax collection. For a time, this worked. The Barmakids, a Persian family originally from Buddhist monastic roots, rose to become the greatest administrative minds of their era. They introduced new paper systems, centralized record-keeping, and staffed offices with highly educated clerks. But even this solution contained the seed of future decay. The Barmakids became too powerful. They built massive estates in Baghdad. They sponsored poets and scholars. They paid soldiers directly and gained favor with the military. Yahya's son, Jafar, became Harun's closest companion, even rumored to be married, secretly, to the Caliph's sister. In time, the line between caliphal authority and vizierial power blurred. And then, in a sudden act still debated by historians, Harun had the Barmakids destroyed. Their palaces were seized, their libraries were closed, Jafar was executed, Yahya was imprisoned. What had once been a partnership in governance turned into suspicion, purging, and silence. Why did Harun do it? Some say it was jealousy. Others blame court intrigue or pressure from the conservative religious factions who disliked the Persian influence. Or perhaps it was fear that he no longer truly ruled. But one truth remains. With the Barmakids gone, Baghdad lost its administrative backbone. No other family could match their efficiency or loyalty. The Diwan fractured. New viziers came and went, each less capable than the last. Corruption returned stronger, smarter, and more entrenched. At the same time, the city itself was evolving not upward but outward. The original round city with its 4 gates and geometric clarity could no longer contain Baghdad's population. New quarters sprang up like weeds, unsanctioned, unregulated, and often unmapped. Tax collectors didn't know who lived there. Guards avoided the narrowest alleys. Fire outbreaks became common. Flooding from the Tigris worsened. The old irrigation systems, once maintained with precision, fell into neglect. Baghdad was now too large to control by paperwork alone. Yet the court remained fixated on ceremony. Harun's processions grew more elaborate. Embassies from foreign lands were received with splendor. Musicians and poets filled the palace halls. Scholars at the House of Wisdom, the Beit al-Hikmah, translated Aristotle and Galen into Arabic. These intellectual feats would echo for centuries, but they were not enough to hold the empire together. Out in the provinces, governors began acting independently. Military commanders, once appointed by the Caliph, now raised their own troops, funded by local taxes. In Egypt, in Khorasan, in the borderlands with Byzantium, the title of Caliph began to feel ceremonial. Real power was decentralizing. Harun, ever aware of threats, turned his gaze eastward. He made a crucial decision: to divide the empire between his two sons. Al-Amin would rule from Baghdad. Al-Mamun, the more scholarly of the two, would rule from Merv, deep in the Persian east. It was meant to prevent conflict. It would cause civil war. But that storm had not yet arrived. In the final years of Harun's reign, the city of Baghdad remained functional, but only just. The bread arrived late. The markets whispered of inflation. Soldiers grumbled about wages. The paper trail grew harder to follow. Some scribes left the city altogether, seeking provincial posts with better pay and fewer eyes. Harun, aging and burdened, took one last journey. In 809, he left Baghdad for the distant province of Khorasan, hoping to quell unrest and reaffirm control. He never returned. He died in the city of Tus, far from the marble arches and scroll-stuffed libraries of the capital he had tried to hold together. Back in Baghdad, his body was returned with ceremony, but his empire was already splitting at the seams. The city he had inherited, perfect in symmetry, brilliant in administration, was becoming something else. Still rich, still proud, but fraying. The round city no longer represented order. Its walls were decorative, no longer defensive. Its bureaucracy, once legendary, was now too slow to respond. The city still glittered by day and hummed with commerce by night. But beneath it all was a silence, the silence of cracks widening, of scrolls misfiled, of trust dissolving. The Golden Age, as we call it now, was never meant to last. No age is. But for a time, Baghdad was proof that cities could be governed by ink as much as iron, by order as much as fear. And when Harun al-Rashid died, he left behind not a monument but a question. Can a city built on bureaucracy survive when the people who run it no longer believe in it? Story 2. The Caliph's Ledger: How Taxes Built an Empire. Before armies could be fed, before scribes could be paid, before palaces could rise above the riverbanks, someone had to count the fields. In the Abbasid Caliphate, taxation was not just a matter of collecting coin. It was the art and burden of measuring the empire. Every village, every canal, every barley field and apricot orchard had to be registered, assessed, and recorded. Not just once, but year after year, season after season. The Caliph's empire stretched from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Sind. To govern such vastness, Baghdad relied on numbers, and those numbers came from the land. The Abbasids inherited this idea from their Persian and Roman predecessors, that the prosperity of a state lies not in conquest, but in calculation. There were two main forms of tax in the empire. The Kharaj-a land tax, paid by landowners and farmers. The Jizya-a poll tax levied on non-Muslims, particularly dhimmis, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, in exchange for protection and exemption from military service. But these taxes were not fixed. They varied by region, by crop, by rainfall, by political whim. One field might pay a flat rate, while another owed a portion of its produce. Some districts were taxed in kind grain, oil, wool, others in coin, measured in dirhams, silver, or dinars, gold. What mattered was recording everything. The tax registers, called Daftar al-Kharaj, were among the most guarded documents in the empire. Written in careful script, often in Persian or Arabic depending on region, they contained the heartbeats of a village. How many goats, how many trees, how many mouths. They read less like scrolls and more like X-rays of a civilization. Each year, local officials sent tax surveys back to Baghdad. They were carried by couriers on horseback, packed tightly in leather cases to protect them from rain and sandstorms. When the scrolls arrived, scribes unpacked them in silence. Errors were common, disputes inevitable. A field listed as irrigated might have dried out months ago. A village recorded as loyal might have rebelled just last week. Still, the process continued slow, meticulous, maddening. To conduct these surveys, the Caliphate employed land inspectors known as al-Kharaj. These men, often feared and hated, rode from village to village carrying measuring ropes, ink pots, and accounts books. They did not ask for stories. They asked for numbers. How wide is the canal? How many oxen plow the field? What did you plant last year? Did the apricots survive the frost? The answers were translated into taxation formulas, some going back to Sasanian times. And yet, these formulas could be brutally flexible. In times of drought, some inspectors offered leniency. In others, they raised the tax to make up for shortfalls elsewhere. Equity was not guaranteed. What was guaranteed, however, was scrutiny. In Baghdad, the Diwan al-Kharaj, the land tax office, kept extensive tables. Each district had its own folder, often chained to a central registry desk to prevent theft. Some scrolls were 20 feet long, others folded into layered packets. The ink faded quickly in the heat. Errors multiplied. Some scribes used color-coded markings. Others developed secret notations known only to senior clerks. But all agreed on one rule: if the numbers didn't add up, someone would suffer. And yet, despite all this, the system functioned not smoothly, not justly, but effectively. The Caliph's treasury filled, armies marched, roads were repaired, mosques funded, scholars paid. The empire moved because taxes flowed. But how did this feel to the people who paid them? In a small village in the Sawad, a farmer might spend 1/3 of his year's income on Kharaj. In fertile years, this was tolerable. In lean years, it was a sentence. Some villages responded with bribery. A coin slipped into the inspector's saddlebag. A sheep gifted the night before the survey. In some regions, whole communities fled their land, moving to forests or mountains to escape taxation altogether, a phenomenon known as Tark al-Ard, abandoning the land. To counter this, the Abbasids introduced cadastral surveys, essentially medieval censuses. Surveyors mapped plots, marked landmarks, and redrew boundaries. Stones were placed to denote borders. Disputes broke out. Lawsuits followed. All of this was recorded. All of it was taxed. And then came the question of the jizya, the poll tax on non-Muslims. Originally a mark of protection under Islamic law, the jizya gradually became both a fiscal tool and a point of tension. In wealthy cities like Mosul or Fustat, Christian and Jewish merchants paid the jizya regularly and often gained considerable influence at court. But in rural areas, resentment grew. Some converted to Islam to avoid the tax. Others hid their faith. In some cases, tax collectors used the jizya as an excuse for harassment. Complaints were filed. Caliphs issued reform edicts. Inspectors were rotated more frequently to prevent abuses. Still, the tax remained both a source of revenue and a reminder of status. So where did all this money go? The Bait al-Mal, or treasury, sat at the core of Baghdad's administrative quarter. Guarded by soldiers and eunuchs, it resembled more a fortress than a bank. Inside, rooms were stacked with bags of coin, jars of spices, bolts of cloth, and crates of imported goods. Tax revenues came not just in silver but in kind: honey from Armenia, cotton from Sind, camels from Yemen. Each item was inventoried, each coin weighed. The treasurer, known as the Khazin, answered directly to the vizier and sometimes the caliph. Theft was punishable by blinding or death. Trust was everything. From this vault, money flowed back out into the empire. Stipends to judges, salaries to scribes, gifts to poets, bribes to tribal leaders, and charity to the poor. The treasury funded irrigation projects, dam repairs, and food subsidies. It was not only a fiscal organ but a political weapon. A governor loyal to the Caliph might be overfunded. A rebellious region might find its tax rebate delayed. The treasury punished as much as it rewarded, not with swords but with silence. By Harun al-Rashid's reign, the treasury was rich beyond measure. Travelers claimed its vaults contained more gold than Rome ever knew, but wealth brought complexity and temptation. New positions were created: auditors, cross-checkers, coin weighers, grain assessors. Each had their own office. Each demanded their own salary. The tax that had once supported the state now risked consuming it. Still, the machinery turned. Baghdad thrived not because of military conquests or golden palaces, but because of a dusty office, filled with ledgers, measuring ropes, and tired eyes. Every time a farmer planted wheat, every time a merchant sold a bolt of cloth, somewhere in the city, a scribe made a note. This was the empire of ink. And yet, how long can any state tax its people without breaking their spirit? You might imagine an empire's tax system as faceless scrolls and seals and silent scribes. But behind the ink and parchment were men, real people, with ambitions, fears, rivalries, and habits. And as the Abbasid tax system matured, it was these men, the collectors, the auditors, the enforcers, who shaped the fate of villages, cities, and even dynasties. The empire called them letter 2BF, a Macron L tax agents, but their roles varied wildly. Some were inspectors, others collectors, others clerks, and some served as informants, embedded quietly in marketplaces and provincial courts. Together, they formed the human backbone of an administrative system that stretched from the Atlas Mountains to the Oxus River. And their job, in a word, was this: bring revenue to Baghdad. But how they did it, that was often more art than policy. In theory, each province sent annual tribute based on land fertility, population, and trade volume. In practice, tax farming, or IQ letter 1E6D a Macron letter 2BF, became increasingly common. The central government, overburdened and far removed from the provinces, began granting tax rights to individuals in exchange for a fixed sum. A wealthy merchant, former general, or court favorite might pay 100,000 dirhams up front to the treasury in Baghdad and be given the right to collect taxes from a district in Syria, Khorasan, or Egypt. Whatever they collected beyond that amount, the surplus was theirs to keep. It was a risky investment. Some made fortunes, others were ruined, but for the caliphate it meant guaranteed income, at least for the moment. This shift changed everything. Now, tax collectors weren't just bureaucrats. They were entrepreneurs, speculators in a high-stakes game that balanced on the edge of legality and cruelty. Some hired private enforcers. Others brought scribes and astrologers, hoping to predict weather patterns and optimize harvest predictions. The tax collector became less like a scribe, more like a warlord with an abacus. In cities like Wasit, Basra, and Ray, tax contractors arrived with pomp. Their caravans bore crates of scales, coins, ledgers, and even physicians, for the journey was long and often dangerous. They rented large homes. They bribed provincial governors for influence. They hosted banquets to gain goodwill from local elites. But in the countryside, their presence was often met with fear. To villagers, a tax collector meant remeasurement of lands, reassessment of dues, and sometimes the confiscation of goods. If a family couldn't pay, the collector might take oxen, grain, or furniture. In rare cases, sons were taken and sold into bonded service, technically illegal, but not unheard of. Complaints flooded the caliphal court. Some made it to the vizier's desk. Fewer still reached the caliph. Even when reform edicts were issued, like the ones Harun al-Rashid occasionally proclaimed, they were unevenly enforced. Baghdad could write laws, but whether they reached the dusty roads of Khuzestan or the distant hills of Ifriqiya was another matter. And yet the empire still needed these men. Without their coin deliveries, Baghdad's economy faltered. Salaries went unpaid. soldiers went unfed, roads went unrepaired. So the state walked a careful line, punish the worst abuses, tolerate the rest. The worst abuses were spectacular. One collector in Armenia imposed taxes so high that entire villages fled across the mountains. Another in Bukhara shaved his beard as a vow not to bathe until he had doubled the year's revenue he succeeded, and then died of fever before collecting his reward. In Baghdad, these men were both feared and envied. Their homes were often among the largest. Their sons attended the same schools as princes. Some collectors married into noble families. Others sponsored mosques, schools, and poets' attempts to cleanse reputations with piety and culture. And then there were the auditors, the quiet men of the Diwan al-Muhasaba. If the collectors were loud, visible, and brash, the auditors were their opposite. They worked in back rooms, hunched over piles of parchment, recalculating provincial returns. They checked for inconsistencies in shipment records. They verified coin weights. They read scribbled notes in the margins and deciphered contradictory seals. It was slow work. Some went blind from candlelight and ink dust. Others developed early arthritis from decades of repetitive script. They lived modestly, rarely spoke in public, and often knew more about the empire than the Caliph himself. But they, too, could be corrupted. Some were paid to overlook falsified ledgers. Others lost reports that exposed governors skimming the treasury. In time, the auditors became as essential and as suspect as the tax agents they monitored. To guard against this, the Abbasids created rotating inspectorates, teams sent from Baghdad to audit provinces in person. They were not always welcomed. In several provinces, their arrival sparked protests. In one case, an inspector was stoned to death in a small Syrian town. His body returned to Baghdad wrapped in an empty grain sack. The city's population wept not for him, but for what his death meant: fewer inspections, higher taxes, less oversight. Meanwhile, the coinage itself was a source of quiet drama. Taxes had to be paid in weighed coin, often of inconsistent purity. Mints operated in major cities: Baghdad, Kufa, Samarra, each stamping gold dinars and silver dirhams with the caliph's name and religious slogans. But mints in provinces sometimes produced counterfeit currency, or clipped coins slightly shaved at the edges, the missing metal melted and resold. To fight this, the treasury appointed coin testers, men trained to detect false weight or impure alloy. They used scales, acid, and bite tests. Some had reputations so fearsome that collectors altered entire shipment plans to avoid their inspection. Still, some counterfeit coins passed. Some cities operated for years on mixed currencies, part official, part forged, all flowing back to Baghdad in leather satchels tied with red cord. It was a mess. And yet through it all, the Abbasid fiscal system endured. It paid for hospitals, bridges, scholars, and mosques. It supported the House of Wisdom and funded embassies to China and Charlemagne's court. It fed 1 million people in Baghdad, even when the harvests failed. It did this not with divine miracles, but with human exhaustion. Harun al-Rashid knew this. His letters often mentioned taxation not in lofty terms, but in mundane ones. He asked for updated ledgers. He ordered remission of kharaj in drought-stricken regions. He dismissed a collector accused of cruelty in Tabaristan. He increased stipends to grain storehouses in years of scarcity. For a caliph remembered in legend as a man of magic and wonder, he spent a great deal of his time reviewing accounts. And why? Because even in the most magnificent empire, prosperity is not magic, it is measured. The city of Baghdad may have been built with gold and vision, but it survived because of coin, rope, ink, and fear. And yet, with all this complexity, one must ask, what happens when the collectors grow stronger than the court that appointed them? By the end of Harun al-Rashid's reign, the Abbasid tax system had reached a kind of terrible perfection. It was efficient but only through coercion. It was rich but often unjust. It was organized but always on the edge of chaos. The empire was a machine that fed itself, and the tax system was its engine. But as any machine runs, its parts begin to wear down, and when it runs too hot for too long, it burns. In the early 800s, that burning began to show. One of the first signs was rebellion in the provinces. Taxation, more than theology or tribal loyalty, drove many early revolts. In Egypt, Khorasan, and parts of the Jazeera, local leaders, often small landlords, former officials, or frustrated religious figures, began refusing to send revenue to Baghdad. Some claimed grievances about excessive Kharaj assessments. Others accused tax collectors of corruption. A few simply saw an opportunity to assert autonomy. The empire, overstretched, responded unevenly. Sometimes the Caliph dispatched envoys with letters promising reform. Other times, troops were sent to reassert fiscal control by force. A village that withheld its dues might see its men conscripted, its elders imprisoned, its wells poisoned. These were not symbolic rebellions. They were about survival. Because to many in the countryside, Baghdad was no longer the source of justice. It was a distant hunger, a city that demanded everything and returned little. This imbalance became increasingly visible after the death of Harun al-Rashid in 809. His two sons, Al-Amin and Al-Mamun, were left to inherit an empire that was already cracking. Their rivalry exploded into full-blown civil war, the fourth fitna, just 2 years later. The reasons were political, but the consequences were financial. During the war, provinces stopped sending taxes altogether. Governors held onto revenues to pay their own militias. Inspectors and collectors were often forced to choose sides, and whichever side they chose, the ledgers suffered. Baghdad itself, once the secure heart of the empire, became paralyzed. The diwan system faltered, the treasury shrank, grain prices surged, salaries went unpaid, public work ceased. Riots broke out in the streets over the cost of bread. The bureaucracy, once a symbol of order, now represented silent ledgers with nothing to report. Al-Mamun eventually emerged victorious, but the damage had been done. The tax system had survived but fractured. Confidence in the central administration was never fully restored. From this point on, the Abbasid Empire would be defined less by its ability to collect revenue and more by its struggle to hold on to it. And yet, even in its decline, the machinery persisted. In smaller towns and cities, local officials continued to collect and account, if not for the Caliph, then for their own survival. Some reinvented themselves as regional dynasts. Others became warlords with clerks. They retained the language and form of the Abbasid fiscal system, the stamped ledgers, the Kharaj rates, the coinage, but the purpose had changed. The state had become decentralized, and with it, the tax system. What had once been a top-down flow of revenue was now a web of competing interests, all mimicking the old system but pursuing different ends. This evolution gave rise to new terms. One such term was muqt, a letter to bf, a person granted the right to collect taxes in a region, often in exchange for military service or political loyalty. This was not the formal IQ letter 1e6d a macron letter 2bf system that would later flourish under the Seljuks, but it was its forerunner, a sign that the state could no longer enforce collection directly and had to delegate power. The dangers of this approach were obvious. The muqt, a letter 2bf, like the tax farmers before him, had no reason to be just. His power was measured in coin. His authority often exceeded that of the local judge. And while he was theoretically answerable to Baghdad in practice, he served only himself. In time, these localized power structures hardened. Cities like Aleppo, Nishapur, and Basra began to operate semi-independently, with their own treasuries, armies, and tax laws, all while keeping the name of the Caliph in the Friday sermon, to preserve the illusion of unity. This was the slow unraveling. Not with a bang, but with new paperwork. And yet, even in this environment, the principles of the Abbasid fiscal system endured. The training of scribes, the structure of ledgers, the language of tax law all survived, and even spread. Later Islamic dynasties, the Fatimids, the Buyids, the Seljuks inherited and adapted these models. In Andalusia, far to the west, Umayyad administrators mimicked Abbasid accounting techniques. In Cairo, Fatimid scribes used Abbasid vocabulary. Even in India, under the Delhi Sultanate centuries later, remnants of the Abbasid revenue structure could be found in administrative practice. So while the empire faltered, its methods endured. And perhaps that's the real story. The Abbasid tax system did not fall. It fragmented. It was absorbed, reinterpreted, localized. But it never disappeared. Its tools, the land register, the kharaj, the ledger seal, became templates for rule across the Islamic world. In the end, what Harun al-Rashid and his administrators built was not just a bureaucracy. It was a fiscal culture, one rooted in numbers, sustained by discipline, and remembered not for its grandeur, but for its quiet durability. And yet you must wonder, if a state's power rests in paper, what happens when no one believes what's written anymore? Story 3. Paper and Power, the Arrival of the Chinese Secret. You might not think that the way people wrote could shape an empire. But in the Abbasid Caliphate, the arrival of one small thing, paper, changed everything. Before it, letters were written on parchment scraped from animal skins, or papyrus from reeds grown along the Nile. Both were expensive, fragile, and limited in supply. Archiving tax records required entire rooms of shelves. Copying the Quran took months. A bureaucrat's mistake might be scratched out with a knife or left to stain a valuable document. Then, around the year 751, in the rugged frontier lands near Talas, everything changed. The Battle of Talas was a relatively minor military skirmish between the Abbasid Caliphate and the Chinese Tang dynasty. The two powers, both massive and curious, had reached into Central Asia and found themselves uncomfortably close. The battle was brief. Arab-led forces defeated a Tang army on the banks of the Talas River, near what is now the border of Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. There were no grand conquests. No territory dramatically changed hands, but among the prisoners captured by the Abbasids were Chinese artisans, and among them, men who knew a secret. The secret of paper making. Paper had been used in China for centuries, a blend of mulberry bark, hemp, rags, and water, beaten into pulp and dried on screens. It was cheap, flexible, and absorbent. Unlike papyrus, it didn't crack in dry air. Unlike parchment, it didn't require slaughtering animals. The Abbasids understood immediately. This was not just a material, it was a technology of empire. The captured artisans were brought back to the city of Samarkand, a regional hub and cultural crossroads. There, with careful observation and no small amount of experimentation, the first Islamic paper mill was established. And from that humble beginning, paper began to flow west, first to Baghdad, then to Basra, then across the Islamic world. In those early years, paper was still seen as exotic. Scribes were suspicious. The ink bled if the surface wasn't properly prepared. Parchment makers resisted its spread, fearing, rightly, for their livelihoods. But paper was cheaper, and the state had grown too large to function on luxury writing materials alone. By the time Harun al-Rashid became Caliph, paper was becoming essential. The Abbasid administration, with its armies of clerks and ledgers, needed a medium that was scalable. The Caliph ordered the construction of paper mills in Baghdad, and under his successors, paper manufacturing spread to Damascus, Cairo, and eventually Andalusia. In some records, paper makers were given tax exemptions, land grants, and protection from prosecution, an early indication of how vital they had become. Soon, entire quarters of Baghdad were devoted to its trade. Paper shops called warakat became centers of commerce, copying, and quiet power. A typical shop might sell Qurans, scientific treatises, tax documents, children's primers, and erotic poetry, all written by hand, of course, but now copied more quickly and more affordably. And so a quiet revolution began. A revolution not of ideas, but of multiplication. Before paper, a book might be owned by a prince or a wealthy merchant. After paper, a modest scholar could afford a personal library. Schools could distribute written texts. Markets could enforce standardized contracts. Poets could see their verses copied and passed from hand to hand or stolen and rebranded. The Caliph's court quickly adapted. The Diwan switched almost entirely to paper by the early 800s. Tax forms, land deeds, court rulings, all were now written on fine sheets manufactured within the empire. Scribes no longer scraped parchment for reuse. Instead, they filed forms by the hundreds, copying legal terms with elegant uniformity, sometimes in Diwani script, a calligraphic style optimized for compactness and speed. The treasury ordered mass production of receipts, stamped with seals and folded in standardized formats. Paper scrolls were filed by district, date, and inspector. Whole rooms were repurposed as archives, where documents were stored in clay jars or wooden chests, sometimes tied with colored string to indicate importance. And with paper came a new class of workers, the copyists. They were not authors, they did not interpret. They simply duplicated legal manuals, books of medicine, works of Aristotle. Their hands were steady, their minds methodical. They worked long hours, often in silence, and many died with ink stains on their fingers and no books of their own. But they were the gears of knowledge's machine. Paper, more than gold, made Baghdad the center of the Islamic world. It allowed for the house of wisdom, the Beit al-Hikmah, to exist, where scholars translated Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic. It allowed for tax forms to be triplicated and distributed across provinces. It allowed for poets to gain fame in cities they never visited. It allowed, too, for standardization. With papyrus or parchment, every document was slightly different. But with paper, the empire could create templates, forms to be filled in, contracts with designated blank lines, letters with dictated phrasing. A governor in Yemen could use the same form as a collector in Khurasan. Instructions flowed faster. Audits became more reliable. Fraud became easier to detect. But not everything was utopian. Paper also enabled forgery. It allowed lies to be written with speed. It enabled bureaucrats to copy decrees with minor edits, giving favors to allies or skimming from the top. Some inspectors traveled with official notaries just to verify the authenticity of documents they received. Seals became more elaborate. Signatures became longer. Still, errors crept in. One missing line in a tax order could bankrupt a village. One extra phrase in a legal ruling could exonerate a guilty man. The power of the pen, always formidable, was now multiplied by 10,000 sheets. Even the Caliph began to fear what paper could do. Harun al-Rashid, known for his patronage of learning, also enforced strict oversight on scribes and clerks. He issued regulations requiring government documents to be copied by approved scribes only. He ordered routine destruction of older records deemed sensitive, especially those dealing with court intrigue, border treaties, or internal dissent. Some scholars claimed that Baghdad's archives were purged every few decades, not from disorganization, but from policy. Too much paper, after all, could be dangerous. It remembered everything. Still, the genie was out of the bottle. Merchants began using paper for contracts. Mosques began copying hadith collections. Booksellers emerged in every major city, and with them, readers. For the first time in Islamic history, a man of modest means could walk into a shop and purchase a copy of Plato or Galen or Al-Jahiz, all written in Arabic, on local paper, copied by local hands. Paper in time would travel further, to Andalusia, to Sicily, to Christian Europe. There it would transform monastic libraries, fuel the growth of universities, and eventually give rise to the printing press. But that was still centuries away. In Baghdad, it was still the age of scribes, and the scribes were busy. They copied the Quran in precise lines. They duplicated tax receipts. They produced manuals on everything from irrigation to inheritance law. They filed and cataloged and corrected and rewrote. And with every page they produced, they shifted the center of knowledge from the sword to the pen, from the battlefield to the bureau. It's strange to think that such a quiet technology could carry such weight. But in the Abbasid world, the most powerful instrument was no longer bronze or iron, it was pressed fiber, dried in the sun, passed hand to hand. And yet as paper spread, so too did something more dangerous. Who would control what was written, and what would happen when they did? By the early 9th century, the Abbasid Caliphate had grown into more than just an empire. It was a paper civilization, a network of ink, memory, and classification. And at the center of this quiet revolution stood the men who controlled the paper, the scribes, known as Kuttab. They were not poets, though they knew poetry. They were not scholars, though many had memorized entire books. They were bureaucrats, but they carried the keys to empire. In earlier times, scribes had been artisans of language. They copied texts, drafted contracts, and wrote in elegant script. But in the Abbasid age of paper, they became managers of reality. With paper cheaper and more abundant, the volume of administration exploded. Orders had to be written, duplicated, sealed, and stored. Messages were dispatched across deserts and mountains. Entire policies on taxation, military recruitment, judicial rulings were recorded and revised. Every level of government now required documentation, and documentation meant scribes. The Kuttab operated in a hierarchy as rigid as any army. At the bottom were apprentice copyists, tasked with duplicating routine forms, land grants, tax receipts, grain reports. Their days were filled with repetition, and their mistakes could cost a village its income. Above them were drafting scribes, those with the authority to compose original documents on behalf of governors, judges, or viziers. These men chose their words carefully. One wrong phrase could be read as treason. A misplaced salutation could insult a tribal chief. The Abbasids were a multicultural empire: Arab, Persian, Turkish, Armenian, Berber, and every letter had to reflect that complexity. At the top stood the chief scribes, who worked directly for the vizier or the caliph himself. These men were powerful, not because they held swords, but because they controlled access to language. They determined which documents were read, which were archived, and which were never written down at all. To understand their power, you must understand how the Abbasid state functioned. It was vast, multilingual, and filled with friction. Governors in distant provinces acted independently. Tribal alliances shifted. Religious scholars debated the legitimacy of every policy. The caliph could not be everywhere, but his letters could. A single scroll bearing the caliph's seal might change a life, a law, or a landscape. And that scroll was written by a scribe. Paper, then, was not just a medium, it was a form of authority. If something was not written, it did not exist. If it was written and copied and sealed, it became real. In this way, the Kuttab were not just clerks, they were architects of reality. Their offices, known as Dawawin singular, Diwan, were housed in the administrative quarter of Baghdad, often near the Tigris. Long halls filled with wooden desks, scroll chests, and ink wells. Paper was stacked in bundles, often dyed for classification: pale blue for tax records, beige for military orders, soft pink for diplomatic correspondence. The scribes wore simple robes but often carried expensive pens, their nibs custom carved and kept in polished bone cases. Some were known to scent their paper with rosewater or saffron, not for luxury, but to deter insects and preserve documents. Their handwriting was studied and classified. A well-trained scribe could produce a single page of script with over 500 characters, evenly spaced and perfectly aligned, without a single error. Margins mattered. Spacing mattered. Even the direction of the folds in official letters followed rules. A misfolded decree could delay a caravan or anger a provincial governor. To join the ranks of the Kuttab required decades of training, often beginning in Quranic schools, followed by years as a copyist, and finally, mentorship under a senior scribe. Mastery of Arabic was essential, but so too was fluency in Persian, Greek, or Syriac, depending on the region and the subject matter. Some scribes specialized in fiqh Islamic law, others in Diwan al-Kharaj land and tax administration. A few, the most elite, managed diplomatic correspondence. These scribes were trusted with the empire's most sensitive letters, treaties with the Byzantines, negotiations with North African rebels, reports from Indian ports. Each of these required more than just transcription. They demanded rhetorical skill, political awareness, and an understanding of what not to say. It was said that a truly masterful scribe could deliver a threat in the form of a compliment, or a refusal in the form of a blessing. With such power came influence and enemies. The viziers, often drawn from powerful Persian families like the Barmakids, relied on scribes to execute policy. But that dependence could turn dangerous. A chief scribe might alter a phrase, delay a letter, or leak a document, subtle acts with enormous consequences. Some scribes used their influence to build shadow networks favoring allies, punishing rivals. Entire careers rose and fell based on a scribe's wording. The Diwan, while appearing bureaucratic, was also a theater of intrigue. Harun al-Rashid, aware of this, monitored the Dawawin carefully. He instituted secret audits, rotating scribes to prevent local corruption. He created dual reporting systems, where provincial offices sent duplicate letters to multiple ministries. Still, he could not prevent what he could not read, and not everything was copied. By the mid-800s, the sheer volume of paper was becoming overwhelming. Some officials began recycling parchment by scraping ink and reusing it, a practice known as palimpsesting. Paper was cheaper but not free. Mills could not always keep up with demand. In dry seasons, when water levels dropped, production stalled, bureaucracies paused. And then there was the problem of storage. The empire needed archives. Records from tax assessments to judicial rulings had to be preserved for years, even decades. Scribes began using mud-sealed clay jars or wrapping scrolls in oiled leather. Rooms were cooled with damp cloths to prevent mold. Some larger offices used rotating record shelves, an early form of file indexing. But with more documents came greater risks. Fires destroyed archives. Insects consumed paper. Wars resulted in plundered offices. In some cases, entire provincial tax records were lost and had to be reconstructed from memory, a task that often invited fraud. Still, the scribes persisted. They trained new apprentices. They copied the same forms. They debated handwriting styles. And through their ink-stained hands, the Abbasid state survived famine, war, and even rebellion. Paper at its peak in Baghdad was everywhere. It was on the shelves of bookshops, in the scrolls of courtrooms, in the libraries of scholars, and in the locked boxes of merchants. Children learned their letters on scrap paper. Poets mailed verses to patrons. Astronomers calculated star charts on sheets of Samarkandi pulp. Even prisoners, awaiting judgment, could request paper to write appeals. This was the paper age of Islam, a time when the act of writing was not just cultural or religious, but foundational to power itself. But with this power came a dangerous question, whispered in court and echoed in alleyways. If the scribe can write the world, who writes the scribe's truth? By the middle of the 9th century, paper was no longer a curiosity. It was assumed like bread, like water, like language itself. But its presence had changed more than just the empire's bureaucracy. It had changed how people thought. In the early Islamic centuries, knowledge was preserved primarily through oral tradition. Students memorized entire texts. Poets recited verses from memory. Legal rulings were transmitted through trusted chains of narration, isnads, linking each scholar to the next. Even the Quran, while written down, was most sacred in its recitation. But with paper, this began to shift. Memory did not disappear, it outsourced itself. A teacher might once have required his students to recite 50 hadith from memory. Now he might ask them to copy them carefully, line by line, onto bound pages. What had once been held in the mind now lived on paper, in script that could be passed from city to city, from century to century. And so books multiplied. The scholar Al-Jahiz, born in Basra in the early 800s, was said to have written over 200 works and to have died when a stack of them collapsed upon him in his study. Though apocryphal, the story captures something true. In the Abbasid world, knowledge now had physical weight. Libraries expanded. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad contained thousands of volumes, works in Arabic, Persian, Syriac, Sanskrit, and Greek. Scholars there translated not only Plato and Aristotle, but also Indian texts on mathematics, Chinese works on medicine, and Persian treatises on administration. Without paper, such an endeavor would have been logistically impossible. Elsewhere, private collectors emerged. Wealthy merchants and officials began amassing personal libraries, books of science, poetry, law, and theology. These collections became status symbols. A man might list not his horses but his books as a measure of dignity. And with paper spread came debate. Some religious scholars worried. Did the ease of writing erode the discipline of memorization? Did the proliferation of books invite misinterpretation, or worse, heresy? Theologians argued over the permissibility of copying sacred texts onto cheap material. Could the name of God be written on pulp? What if it were discarded or defiled? Fatwas were issued. Special protocols were developed for disposing of paper that bore divine names: burning, burial, immersion in running water. The spiritual met the administrative, and both now flowed on the same fibers. Meanwhile, the book trade flourished. Markets in Baghdad featured entire streets dedicated to paper, ink, and books. The Suq al-Warakin, the stationer's market, became a hub not just of commerce, but of culture. There, one could buy a bound copy of the Quran, a commentary on logic, a manual on pigeon breeding, or the latest satire from a popular poet. Some shops even offered custom bindings and decorative margins, artistry, in addition to information. Students crowded around shop windows, peering at newly arrived titles. Travelers carried books in saddle bags, spreading ideas from city to city. And with this movement came variations, different versions, regional styles, marginal notes. To control information now meant controlling not people, but manuscripts. The Abbasid state understood this. Certain books were banned, others were commissioned. Rulers paid poets and scholars to write favorable histories. Libraries were censored during political unrest. A single treatise could cause a man's exile or his rise to power. And yet, the power of paper could not be fully directed. Ideas once confined to a room could now outlive their authors. A controversial opinion, once whispered in a private debate, might be copied in Damascus, read in Kairouan, and debated again in Cordoba, decades later, all because a single scribe had seen fit to write it down. This diffusion of knowledge was not always welcome. In the mid-800s, theological conflicts rocked the Abbasid court. The Mutazilites, rationalist thinkers supported by Caliph al-Ma'mun, promoted a view of God that emphasized reason and metaphor. Their opponents, the traditionalists, rejected this, insisting on a literal understanding of Scripture. At the heart of their conflict, writings. Each group produced treatises, counterarguments, and public letters, all copied, sold, and circulated. The paper trails became weapons. The courtroom became a scroll room. And when al-Ma'mun initiated the Mihna, an inquisition testing scholars' beliefs. It was often paper evidence that decided a man's fate. In this way, paper became both record and battlefield. But not all written words were polemical. In the quiet corners of Baghdad and beyond, physicians wrote manuals on surgery, farmers copied guides on irrigation, astrologers drew diagrams predicting planetary movements, women in elite households wrote poetry, children learned to trace letters with charcoal on offcuts of used documents. Paper had become commonplace, but its effects were not. One of the most profound changes came in the world of law. Before paper, a dispute might rely solely on oral testimony. After paper, it might be resolved by contracts signed, sealed, and witnessed. Judges began requiring written records. Wills were now filed, property deeds archived, marriage agreements copied in triplicate. And with that, a kind of bureaucratic subjecthood emerged. To exist in the eyes of the state now meant having a paper trail proof of your birth, your land, your debt, your divorce. It gave people recourse, yes, but it also made them legible, trackable, accountable. The empire no longer governed only by edict and sword. It governed by document. Yet even this system had limits. When Baghdad was sacked by the Mongols in 1258 centuries after Harun al-Rashid, it was said that the Tigris ran black with ink from the libraries thrown into the river. A poetic image, perhaps, but one that echoes the fragility of what had been built. Paper had preserved knowledge, but it could also be lost in an afternoon. Still, not all was destroyed. Books had traveled, copies had multiplied. A single manuscript in Basra might have 4 duplicates in Fez, 3 more in Cairo, and a partial translation in Samarkand. Knowledge, once fragile and centralized, was now diffused, redundant, resilient. All because of paper. The Abbasid Caliphate, like all empires, would decline, but its legacy, especially in how it transmitted thought, would persist. Islamic scholarship would flourish in West Africa, in South Asia, in Ottoman libraries and Mughal courts. And beneath every golden illumination and every ornate binding was the same thing. Pulp beaten with water, dried in the sun, and written on by hand. So it is that one of the Abbasids' greatest achievements wasn't built in stone or bronze. It wasn't a palace or an army. It was a system of thought, sustained on sheets thin enough to tear, yet strong enough to carry civilization across continents and centuries. And yet one must wonder, if our memory now lives on paper, what happens when the paper forgets? Story 4. Servants of the Pen, the Scribal Bureaucracy. The Abbasid Empire was not built by soldiers alone. It was built by scribes, men whose hands trembled with ink rather than steel, whose discipline was not shouted across battlefields, but whispered in offices filled with parchment and silence. These were the Kutab scribes, recorders, writers of letters and laws. You could pass by a scribe in the marketplace and never notice him. His robes were modest, his sandals dusty. He carried no sword, no visible sign of power, but give him a pen and a sealed order, and he could move an army, exile a governor, or forgive a debt that had broken a family. And like all positions of power, the path to becoming a scribe began in apprenticeship. The journey began young, usually between the ages of 7 and 10. A boy would begin at the maktab, a primary school where he learned to recite the Quran, memorize basic grammar, and copy Arabic script. Some were taught at home by fathers or uncles who were scribes themselves. Others learned under hired tutors or in mosque courtyards where inkpots outnumbered prayer rugs. At first, the child practiced on wooden tablets, tracing letters in soot and water. When mistakes were made, and there were always mistakes, they were washed clean, and the boy began again. Days passed in repetition, Aleph, Ba, Ta, over and over, until the wrist no longer trembled and the pen followed the mind's command. Once basic literacy was mastered, the real education began, calligraphy. This was not art for its own sake. A scribe's handwriting had to be legible, consistent, and pleasing to the eye. Official documents were judged by the clarity of their script as much as the content of their words. One misstroke could lead to confusion, or worse, insult. The difference between a command and a request might be a single curve. So boys spent years copying sample texts, verses from the Quran, lines of poetry, fictitious letters of state. They were taught spacing, ink balance, and the angle at which to cut the reed pen, the kalam. Instructors checked margins with rulers and required lines to remain straight without the aid of guidelines, a true test of mastery. The best students graduated to copying real documents under the watch of senior scribes. They began to learn the bureaucratic vocabulary of the state, phrases like Bismihi Ta'ala to open letters, or Kala Amir al-Mu'minin to invoke the Caliph's authority. They memorized formulas for tax notices, court rulings, military reports. They were not just learning to write, they were learning to speak the state's language. But mastery of writing was only part of the training. A scribe also had to understand administration, law, custom, and geography. He had to know the proper titles of provincial governors, the rank of various court officials, the names of cities and districts from the Atlantic coast to the Indus River. A scribe who confused a tribal title or misaddressed a commander could find himself demoted, dismissed, or worse. And so the best scribes were also students of the world. They read historical chronicles, studied legal rulings, and kept abreast of court politics. They debated grammar, style, and structure. They wrote letters for clients and copied texts for scholars. Some even moonlighted as poets, their fluency with language spilling into rhyme. Eventually, a talented young scribe might be noticed by a senior bureaucrat and offered a post in one of the state's diwans. This was the great leap from ink-stained apprentice to servant of the pen. There were many diwans, each with its own specialty. Diwan al-Rasil, the chancery, handling official correspondence. Diwan al-Kharaj, land and tax administration. Diwan al-Barid, the postal service, and often imperial intelligence. Diwan al-Jund, the military pay and service roles. Diwan al-Zimam, internal audit and accountability. Each office had its own hierarchy, rituals, and expectations. New scribes were given minor posts, perhaps organizing files, checking figures, or copying standard forms. Their goal was to earn trust, avoid errors, and wait for opportunity. A scribe's workspace was simple: a low desk, bundles of paper tied with twine, a reed pen sharpener, a knife for scraping errors, and an ink pot with multiple chambers, one for black ink, one for red headings, one for gold embellishments used in formal decrees. The scribe's greatest tools, however, were discretion and silence. He saw everything: the caliph's letters, the vizier's instructions, the tax records of wealthy elites. He knew when orders contradicted earlier ones. He noticed when documents were copied more times than necessary. He might even suspect which orders were being forged or revised behind closed doors. And yet he said nothing. A good scribe followed orders. A great scribe anticipated them. A foolish scribe voiced his doubts and often disappeared. In this way, the Abbasid scribal class became both the most educated and the most guarded layer of society. They were not aristocrats, but they had access to aristocracy. They were not merchants, but they recorded every trade. They were not judges, but they wrote the laws. Their power was always proximate, never direct. And yet, no law could pass, no army move, no coin change hands without their written approval. They lived quietly, often in small houses near the palace or in quarters designated for government employees. Their days were filled with ink and protocol. Their evenings, if free, were spent copying private books for extra income or tutoring aspiring students. Some became rich, most did not, but they all shared a particular pride: they made the empire run. And for that reason, the scribes were both revered and resented. Merchants cursed their delays, Governors feared their reports. Poets envied their precision. And yet all knew without the scribe nothing moved forward. The pen was not just mightier than the sword. It gave the sword its orders. But such power could not exist without pressure. As the empire grew, the demands on the bureaucracy increased. Errors became more frequent. Factions formed within the diwans, some loyal to viziers, others to provincial leaders. Promotions were bought. Favors were exchanged. Silence became currency. A young scribe might rise quickly or fall just as fast. And still, every morning they returned to their desks, unrolling scrolls, sharpening pens, warming ink pots over oil lamps. Baghdad woke to the sound of prayers and market calls, but somewhere in a quiet room, a scribe was already writing. And one might ask, in a world ruled by written orders, what happens when the servants of the pen begin to write their own? In the marble courts of the Abbasid caliphs, the voice of the state was spoken in gold-threaded robes and issued from behind veils and curtains. But if you looked closer, if you moved past the columns and guards, you would find another voice, quieter, less adorned, but just as potent. It came from the scribes. By the mid-9th century, the scribal class had matured into a formalized, hierarchical bureaucratic elite loyal not only to the caliph, but increasingly to itself. And that had consequences. At first, their role had been humble, to write what they were told, to preserve the words of others. But paper changed that. So did the growing complexity of empire. As new provinces were annexed, as courts multiplied, as law and theology became more intricate, scribes were increasingly required not just to copy but to interpret. They wrote legal opinions on behalf of judges. They drafted policy orders for governors. They crafted public decrees that shaped public sentiment. They chose words, and sometimes those choices changed everything. A decree could be soft or severe. A summons could be phrased as an invitation or a threat. The wording of a tax edict could ease rebellion or provoke it. It was said that during the civil war between Harun al-Rashid's sons, Al-Amin and Al-Mamun, a single letter written by a senior scribe in Baghdad, subtle in tone, vague in commitment, helped tip a provincial governor's loyalty. Whether true or embellished, the legend reflects the deeper truth. The scribes had become part of the political game. And like all players in politics, they formed alliances. The most important of these was with the vizier, the caliph's chief executive. The vizier depended on scribes for everything: orders, finances, communication, espionage. In return, the vizier protected his scribes, promoted their careers, and rewarded their loyalty with influence. The greatest vizier-scribe alliance in Abbasid history was the one formed between the caliphs and the Barmakid family. Originally Buddhist administrators from Balkh who converted to Islam and rose through the court ranks, the Barmakids were both patrons of scholars and masters of bureaucracy. Their offices, especially under Yahya and his son Jafar, ran with astonishing efficiency. Scribes were trained, rotated between diwans, and promoted based on skill. For a time, it seemed the Abbasid administration might become a true meritocracy. But power begets suspicion. In 803, Harun al-Rashid suddenly ordered the downfall of the Barmakids. Their wealth was seized, their leaders imprisoned or executed. The reasons are still debated: fear of growing influence, accusations of corruption, or perhaps personal betrayal. But for the scribes of Baghdad, the lesson was clear. They served at the pleasure of the court, and pleasure was a fragile thing. After the fall of the Barmakids, the scribal bureaucracy retracted into itself, wary, careful, and increasingly factional. New viziers came and went, some lasting only months. With each change, scribes had to adapt. Those loyal to the previous administration might find themselves reassigned to minor posts in far-off provinces. Some were imprisoned. A few were blinded, a cruel irony for men whose greatest tool was their ability to read and write. In time, scribes learned to survive through ambiguity. They developed a writing style that was formal, respectful, and purposefully vague. A single sentence might contain layers of meaning. A tax order might include a conditional clause that allowed for discretion. A military report might downplay bad news with careful phrasing. These were not just habits of style, they were strategies of survival. A smart scribe left room for retreat in his words. But not all scribes were content with mere survival. Some began to rise higher too high in the eyes of many. A few gained independent influence, acting as intermediaries between the provinces and the court. Governors trusted their scribes more than distant ministers. Merchants bribed scribes to smooth customs disputes. Even judges sometimes deferred to scribes when navigating complex administrative laws. By the late 800s, certain senior scribes were operating almost as unofficial viziers. Their names appeared in multiple diwans. Their sons were given courtly positions. Their estates, once modest, grew large. Some even hosted literary salons, gatherings of poets, theologians, and officials where verses were recited, policies debated, and alliances quietly forged. In these salons, the pen became a currency. A poem written in praise of a scribe might be repaid with a lucrative copying contract. A legal scholar might gain patronage by praising a scribe's reform of inheritance forms. Even court historians understood. To gain access to archives, one must first gain the favor of the scribes who managed them. It was a quiet rise, invisible to the crowds in Baghdad's markets or the soldiers on the frontiers. But in the corridors of the Caliphate's palace, everyone knew. The pen now ruled alongside the sword. This rise prompted another shift from individual scribes to scribal families. Once most scribes were trained through apprenticeship. Now scribal dynasties emerged, families who passed down posts, networks, and techniques. Their sons trained early. Their nephews served in provincial offices. Their daughters, though excluded from formal posts, often helped manage correspondence behind the scenes. These families controlled access to knowledge, and with that, access to power. They were not immune to rivalry. Competing scribal houses clashed over appointments, contracts, and privileges. Factions formed around linguistic style, legal interpretation, even penmanship. A scribe trained in Basra might dismiss the bloated script favored in Kufa. A scribe trained in Persian bureaucracy might challenge the Arabic purity of his rivals. Their debates spilled into marginalia, cryptic critiques written in the corners of copied documents, and into private letters laced with sarcasm and style. But these rivalries rarely exploded into violence. They were waged in silence, in the placement of words, in the approval or delay of a document, in a promotion that arrived too late to matter. And still the scribes worked. Every morning, Baghdad's diwans opened with the sound of pen to paper. Every evening, scribes returned home with ink on their sleeves and secrets in their memory. They had become essential, irreplaceable, and dangerously aware of it. Yet their greatest power was also their greatest risk. They were everywhere, and they remembered everything. And in a system built on documents, the one who remembers controls not just the present, but the past. So what happens when the ones who preserve the past begin to rewrite it? The Abbasid Caliphate once ran on the strength of its paper, its posts, and its scribes. But even the most stable machine falters when its parts begin to serve themselves. By the end of the 9th century, the scribal bureaucracy had grown too large, too complex, and too powerful to remain merely a tool of governance. It had become, in many ways, a realm within a realm, a parallel state of ink and seals, bound not by swords or banners, but by access, silence, and memory. And the cracks began to show. One of the first to notice was not a caliph or a vizier, but a judge. In Basra, a qadi reviewing a land dispute found two copies of the same deed, one stating that a farm belonged to a merchant, the other to a tribal leader. Both bore seals. Both matched official scribal style, but neither could be fully verified. The scribes, when questioned, gave conflicting accounts, some citing memory, others written ledgers. The case was never resolved. The land was seized by the state. Both parties left empty-handed. It was a small case, but it represented a larger problem. The trust that once underpinned the scribal class, their neutrality, their accuracy, their integrity, was no longer assumed. Some scribes had begun to see themselves not as servants of the Caliph, but as guardians of statecraft, autonomous interpreters of policy, memory, and history. They didn't just write, they decided what was written. They didn't just record, they selected what to preserve. They didn't just communicate, they curated reality. In doing so, they sometimes shaped events more than the caliphs themselves. There were incidents whispered about in court. A scribe in Kufa who rewrote a military dispatch, softening the language of defeat into strategic withdrawal. A senior bureaucrat in Wasit who altered tax records to favor merchants who had supported his cousin's bid for governorship. A legal scribe in Baghdad who destroyed incriminating evidence against a noble family, citing clerical error. Most of these stories never made it into official chronicles, but their consequences lived on in ruined villages, unjust trials, altered maps. And yet the scribes still wielded the pen, because there was no one else who could. Attempts to reform the bureaucracy failed. Caliphs tried centralizing record-keeping, creating standardized forms, rotating offices more frequently. But the scribes adapted. They trained faster. They shared codes. They wrote in shorthand or in regional dialects. Some even formed scribal unions, pledging loyalty not to the state but to one another. At the same time, knowledge began to fragment. Different offices recorded the same event in slightly different ways. Court historians deferred to scribes for official narratives. Tax ledgers contradicted land grants. Archive rooms overflowed. A decree issued in Baghdad might be copied 3 times and each version slightly diverged. Sometimes this was simple error. Other times it was deliberate ambiguity designed to allow flexibility or deniability. The empire, once governed by clarity, was now ruled by paper fog. Even the caliphs began to feel it. Al-Muqtadir, one of the last powerful Abbasid rulers of the 10th century, complained that "my words returned to me changed." What he meant was that the orders he issued came back, days or weeks later, rewritten, reinterpreted, filtered through layers of scribal mediation. It was no longer clear who was speaking in the name of the Caliph and who was speaking in place of him. This erosion of clarity had real effects. Provinces used differing legal codes based on local scribal tradition. Military commands were delayed or lost, buried under duplicative documentation. Tax collection slowed, with disputes over jurisdiction and misfiled exemptions. Royal decrees were forged by enterprising governors with access to scribal offices. And yet, despite this confusion, the scribes remained untouchable. Why? Because no one else could read the records. Because no one else knew where the ledgers were kept. Because even the Caliph himself needed a scribe to issue his next command. In this way, the scribes became like memory itself, indispensable but fallible. In Baghdad's diwans, there were still men of integrity, careful, principled bureaucrats who believed in the sanctity of the written word. But they were outnumbered by circumstance, by overwork, by politics, by the sheer volume of paper that now moved through the empire's veins. The scribes had always been meant to remember. But now, increasingly, they were rewriting. Not out of malice, but out of necessity. Not for power, but for survival. And in doing so, they reshaped the caliphate. What the sword conquered, the scribe confirmed. What the taxman gathered, the scribe justified. What the caliph dreamed, the scribe drafted. History, law, economy, War all now lived first on paper, and only then in the world. By the 10th century, the Abbasid state was still rich, still proud but fragile. Its administration was dense, its memory fragmented, its center eroding. The Caliph still ruled in name, but it was the scribes who remembered, recorded, rephrased, and sometimes forgot. And what does it mean when an empire's memory begins to misremember? Perhaps the final lesson of the Abbasid scribal system is not in its corruption or its decline, but in its overreach. They tried to capture the entire world in scrolls, but the world changed faster than they could copy it. And in the end, no matter how many ledgers they bound or seals they pressed, the scribes could not stop what was coming. Because no empire can outright its own unraveling. And so we're left to wonder, if the scribes wrote the world, who will write theirs? Story 5. Merchants and Misers, the Commerce of the Abbasid Streets. If you entered Baghdad at sunrise during the 9th century, you wouldn't first notice the Caliph's palace or the minarets of the mosques. You'd notice the markets. You'd hear the calls of vendors before you smelled the spices or saw the stacked cloth. From the gate of Kark to the eastern district of Rusafa, Baghdad was not just a capital of politics, it was a city of trade. And its most powerful figures weren't generals or poets, they were merchants. The Abbasid Caliphate sat at the crossroads of the ancient world's great commercial arteries. From the Indus to the Nile, from China to the Atlantic coast of Morocco, goods flowed through the empire like blood through a body, and Baghdad was its heart. Each morning, shopkeepers lifted wooden shutters and swept dust from their thresholds. Coffee had not yet arrived in the Islamic world, that would come centuries later, but dates, water, and sour yogurt drinks fueled the city's early commerce. Children fetched change for their fathers. Apprentices opened ledgers and weighed goods on bronze scales. The bazaar, or souk, was not a single location but a network of specialized lanes. There was a street for leather, a corridor for spices, an alley for silk. The city's stationers' market sold paper by the ream. The gold market glittered behind barred counters. The perfume district carried a constant haze of rosewater and musk. Each trade had its guild, informal associations of merchants who regulated weights, prices, apprenticeships, and disputes. Guild leaders often acted as mediators in conflicts. Some even liaised with the state, lobbying for tax relief or better security on caravan routes. And though they were not noble by birth, the wealthiest among them wielded real influence. Some financed mosques, others lent to provincial governors. A few even purchased estates or sponsored scholars. The lines between commerce, piety, and power were not clear, nor did anyone try to make them so. Still, most merchants lived modestly. Their power came not from ostentation, but from liquidity, from the quiet accumulation of coin, contract, and connection. One such merchant might own a shop in the cloth market, partial shares in 2 merchant caravans to Basra and Nishapur, a storage warehouse in the southern district, and a ledger of debts owed, written in careful script. To outsiders, he looked like a shopkeeper, but on paper, he controlled streams of wealth that moved silently through the city. And paper mattered. Merchants learned quickly that verbal contracts were rarely enough, so they hired scribes to draft sale deeds, loan agreements, and shipping manifests. The use of written receipts, sealed in wax or tied with colored thread, became widespread. A merchant might carry a folded ledger book the size of his hand, in which transactions were written daily, often in Arabic, but sometimes in Persian or Judeo-Arabic, depending on background. Because merchants were not all alike. Some were Arab Muslims, others were Persian, Christian, Jewish, or Zoroastrian. In coastal cities, Indian, Nubian, and even Chinese merchants appeared with their own languages and customs. Baghdad, though governed by Islam, was a pluralistic economy. This diversity was tolerated and often welcomed so long as taxes were paid and public order preserved. The Islamic law of dhimma offered non-Muslims the right to trade in exchange for a poll tax, jizya, and adherence to public codes. Disputes were usually settled within each community. But when conflicts crossed boundaries, say, between a Muslim seller and a Christian buyer, they were sometimes heard by market inspectors, muhtasibs, appointed by the state to uphold fairness. The muhtasib carried a ledger, a staff, and authority to act on the spot. He checked weights and measures. He tested purity of oils. He punished those who mixed old grain with new or sold sour wine as vinegar. His role was not just economic, it was moral. Commerce, in the Islamic worldview, was a form of worship, and deception was a form of corruption. Still, the streets were filled with gray areas. A merchant might sell fabric dyed with forbidden substances, then donate part of his profit to a local mosque. A grocer might raise prices just before the Hajj caravan departed and justify it as market demand. The line between commerce and exploitation was blurred, negotiated daily between profit, piety, and practicality. And behind it all, the real commerce often happened after hours. In back rooms, over shared trays of dried fruit and salted almonds, merchants arranged partnerships. These partnerships, called mudaraba, involved one party contributing capital and another labor or travel. Profits were shared. Losses were absorbed by the investor. This model allowed commerce to expand without banks. A merchant in Baghdad could invest in a caravan to India without ever leaving home. His agent would carry goods, sell them abroad, and return with spices, dyes, and perhaps news from foreign ports. Some merchants grew international in scale. They had agents in Alexandria, port warehouses in Oman, and shipping contacts as far as Guangzhou. They employed navigators, translators, and scribes. They understood monsoon patterns. They negotiated customs with multiple governments. And they did all of it without a telephone, a bank, or a printed form, only through paper, memory, and trust. And trust was everything. A reputation for honesty meant easier contracts, lighter inspection, and community protection. A single proven deception could destroy a career. For this reason, many merchants left wills, ledgers, and statements of debt with local notaries. If they died abroad, a common fate, their affairs could still be settled. But wealth inevitably drew resentment. Among some scholars, especially from more ascetic schools, merchants were viewed with suspicion, accused of hoarding, of feeding greed, of distracting from spiritual life. The Quran praised fair trade, but condemned miserliness. Some preachers warned of the merchant who counts his coin as though it will save him. In public sermons, the language was sharp. What good is your warehouse when your grave has no lock? What weight is your gold when the scales of judgment rise? Still, merchants listened, nodded, and returned to their shops. Because in the Abbasid economy, commerce was not just tolerated, it was necessary. The state taxed it, the people depended on it, the city ran on it. And Baghdad's greatness was not only in its scholars and poets, but in its porters, scale makers, scented paper receipts, and flour-dusted shop ledges. It was in the ledgers never bound, the contracts never copied twice, the debts that were paid only with a handshake and a verse from the Quran. And yet, even in this seemingly honest world of fair weights and sealed contracts, one must ask, when coin moves faster than conscience, how long can the market keep its soul? In the heart of Baghdad, beneath the domed roofs of the cloth bazaar, a dispute began quiet at first, but like most things in commerce, it grew. A merchant named Ibrahim al-Kufi accused his partner of cheating him on the division of profits from a silk caravan sent to Nishapur. The partner, an older man named Hassan ibn Mikkel, denied it. The ledgers were brought out, thin as parchment, fat with numbers. Each man had his own version, each page adorned with notes from scribes, each claim wrapped in layers of ambiguity. It was not a rare scene. Because where trade lives, trust erodes. And in the Abbasid economy, partnership was both a tool and a trap. For all its vibrancy, Abbasid commerce ran on informal arrangements. There were no central banks, no formal arbitration courts for merchants. Disputes were heard by qadis or market inspectors, or, when both parties agreed, by local elders or religious scholars. These judges applied a mix of Islamic law, Sharia, and customary commercial practice, urf. But these judgments were not always clear-cut. Sharia emphasized fairness and good faith, but often lacked the tools to dissect complex financial arrangements. So the real verdicts, more often than not, were rendered socially, not legally. A merchant who cheated a partner might win a case but lose all future deals. In Baghdad, as in most trading cities, reputation was credit. A man whose name soured lost access to capital. His name was whispered cautiously, then not at all. This produced a culture of public modesty, where even the wealthiest merchant dressed simply, spoke softly, and donated visibly to charitable causes. Many merchants took their obligations seriously. They paid their zakat, the obligatory alms tax, as a matter of faith. Some went further, funding water wells, schools, and free food stalls during Ramadan. In many towns, it was the merchant class, not the ruling elite, who supported the Waqf system, charitable endowments that built mosques and sustained hospitals. The irony was not lost on observers. Those who chased profit by day sought redemption by night. And some did more than that. The biography of Muhammad ibn Sa'd al-Tamr, a date merchant from Basra, tells of a man who rose from poverty to wealth by selling dried fruit to sailors, but who died owning nothing but his account book, having given the rest away. In his final days, he was visited by scholars who sought his advice not on trade, but on ethics. His notes, copied by a student, were later quoted in a 10th century treatise on business morality. He was unusual but not alone. There existed a long tradition, especially in Sufi-influenced communities, of integrating commerce with spiritual discipline. These merchants spoke of the halal dinar, wealth earned cleanly, spent wisely, and never allowed to dominate the soul. But such idealism had its limits. The economic pressure in Baghdad and other major cities was intense. Rents were high, taxes were rising, port fees grew steeper with each caliphate budget shortfall. Inflation struck periodically, driven by war, harvest failures, or monetary debasement. When copper coinage was diluted to make more change, the cost was felt by market women, apprentices, and porters. To survive, many merchants took shortcuts. They bought damaged goods cheap and passed them off as fresh. They underweighed grain by hiding sand in sacks. They reused oil containers with misleading labels. They forgot to record profits when paying taxes. One trick involved hollowed-out weights lead containers shaped to standard sizes, but filled with lighter material. Another was to dry silk with heat to increase its tension, making it seem more luxurious until the fabric unraveled days later. The Muhtazib, market inspector, was meant to catch such abuses, but he was only one man, often underpaid, often beholden to the very merchants he was meant to regulate. Some were honest, others looked the other way for a price. Bribes came in many forms: a coin slipped under a parchment, a share in a caravan, a promise to fund a cousin's marriage. This wasn't considered corruption exactly. More often it was described as easing the wheel. And yet, the most successful merchants were often not the most dishonest, but the most adaptive. They invested in information. They paid port guards for news of arriving ships. They trained sons to recognize fabric quality by smell alone. They sponsored scribes to copy trade manuals or astronomical charts. Some grew wealthy not from trade itself but by financing others. They became lenders, creditors, and guarantors. Their wealth sat not in gold, but in debt structured, layered, legally hedged by silent partners and rotating agents. One Baghdad merchant in the 870s, Abdullah al-Banna, operated 4 shops but owned none. He had instead leased each to a trusted young merchant in return for a share of profits. His entire income came from rent, partnerships, and commissions. He was known as the Invisible Merchant. This shift marked a deeper change in Abbasid commerce. Merchants were no longer just shopkeepers, they were becoming early capitalists. They created webs of investment, layering risk across regions. They diversified holdings. Some even speculated on futures promising goods that had not yet arrived, betting on the strength of a caravan or the reliability of a harvest. And with that change came anxiety. Older scholars wrote with unease about these new financial tools. The theologian Ibn Qutayba warned against the man who profits from what he has not touched, who buys what he has not seen. He feared a world in which coin moved faster than justice, and debt outpaced obligation. But the cities were already changing. Paper had replaced memory, ledgers had replaced trust, and what was once a market of neighbors had become an empire of credit, paper, and distance. By the end of the 9th century, even the Caliph's treasury borrowed from merchant syndicates. Some merchants held tax farming contracts, paying upfront in gold for the right to collect taxes from a province and keeping whatever surplus they could extract. It was legal, it was profitable, it was also widely resented, especially by the poor. In alleyways behind the main sucks, the complaints grew louder. The shopkeepers keep the good flour for themselves. They weigh the oil with wet fingers. The market closes early, but the prices rise late. Some complaints were true, others were born of hardship. But all reflected the growing divide between those who traded for survival and those who traded to build dynasties. And yet, even in this imbalance, life went on. The bread seller rose before dawn. The rug merchant arranged his bolts by color. The copper beater hammered pots in rhythmic tones. The smell of cardamom drifted between shop awnings, and a young apprentice scribbled down prices in the margin of a receipt, dreaming of one day having a stall of his own. Because no matter how complex the economy became, no matter how distant the merchants grew from the street, the market still began with a hand passing coin to hand, and the quiet hope that tomorrow the scales would still be fair. Still, we are left to ask, if profit becomes the measure of all things, who measures the merchant? By the dawn of the 10th century, the Abbasid Caliphate had begun to change in a way no army or revolution could reverse. It became an empire of commerce first, and of conquest second. This transformation didn't come by decree. It came through habit, the repetition of 1,000 daily transactions, of coins pressed into palms, of ink scrawled on parchment, of quiet nods behind market stalls. And the merchant stood at the center. Not in the way kings do, visible, ceremonial, gilded, but in the way that roots anchor trees, unseen yet essential. Their names were rarely inscribed on palace stones, but their influence echoed through shipping routes, tax policies, and courtly economies. They had become, in many ways, the quiet governors of the Abbasid world. By now, trade routes stretched from Tang China to the Straits of Gibraltar, stitched together by merchants who had never met each other, but who trusted the same patterns of contracts, of coinage, of cargo manifests inked in Arabic script. In port cities like Suraf, Aden, and Basra, docks groaned with ceramic jars of pepper from Kerala, teakwood from Africa, porcelain from the South China Sea. Ships called dhow plied the Indian Ocean, their captains reciting navigation poetry, ancient verses tying starlight to port distance. And behind each shipment stood an investor, often in Baghdad, who had never left his city, but whose wealth now circled the oceans. The merchant had become a global figure, long before globalization was a word. But this vast reach had unintended consequences. In cities where merchant wealth ballooned, so too did the cost of living. Inns raised prices. Bread sellers cut flour with chaff. House rents doubled in a generation. The poorest families moved outward, pushed to the city's edge, away from clean water, reliable mosques, and the bustling markets that once defined community. A visitor to Baghdad in the late 9th century might still marvel at its boulevards and libraries, but they would also hear, in back alleys and between shuttered stalls, a new kind of grumbling. This city belongs to the coin counters. The Caliph's seal matters less than a merchant's favor. Who weighs the scales now, the mutazib, or the man who pays him? Even the poets, once the darlings of the court, began to turn their verse against merchant greed. A satirical quatrain from the time reads, "He prays with one hand, tallies coin with the other, but forgets to weigh his soul when measuring butter." The critique was not just economic, it was moral. To some scholars, especially the jurists and Sufis, the rise of merchant wealth signaled a spiritual crisis. They argued that coin had become the arbiter of justice, not the Quran, that a pious man without capital was ignored, while a miser with spice ships was honored, that the bazaar had replaced the mosque as the heart of the city. And yet, for all this criticism, the empire could not do without the merchants. By the 10th century, the Abbasid state was deeply in debt. Wars on the frontier drained the treasury. Court extravagance continued. Droughts and crop failures pinched tax revenue. The caliphate turned increasingly to merchant loans, tax farming, and private financiers. In some cases, entire provinces were leased to merchant consortia, wealthy traders who paid the government up front, then collected taxes however they saw fit. The arrangement was efficient and brutal. Tax collectors hired by merchants had no incentive to show mercy. Their loyalty was not to the state, but to profit. This was not governance, it was outsourcing survival. And it marked a slow erosion of the very idea of the caliphate as a just and paternal ruler. The Caliph, once the moral center of the Islamic world, now relied on interest-bearing debt, sometimes veiled through loopholes but widely known. Still, merchants continued to fund public works, mosques, madrasas, and hospitals. Their donations filled the gaps the state could no longer afford, and in doing so, they won a kind of quiet legitimacy. Children born into merchant families no longer sought clerical positions or military posts. They trained as accountants, navigators, and lettered investors. The prestige of the merchant had shifted from the margins to the center. And yet, wealth did not protect them all. When political unrest shook the empire, as it often did, merchants were among the first targeted. Their homes were looted during revolts. Their ships were seized by pirates. Their ledgers were burned by rivals. In times of famine, angry crowds accused grain dealers of hoarding. In times of war, soldiers requisitioned goods without compensation. Merchants, for all their wealth, had no army, no court, no shield, only paper promises, and the fragile armor of public reputation. So they adapted again. Some moved their operations abroad to Cairo, Aleppo, Samarkand. Others diversified into safer investments, jewelry, land, or intellectual property, such as copying rights to popular books. A few founded merchant academies, training new generations in the art of trade, contract law, and ethics, an early version of what we might call a business school. And so the Abbasid economy shifted again, becoming not merely a system of exchange, but a culture of commerce, embedded in daily life, in how cities were built, how justice was administered, how knowledge was transmitted. Because when coin moves faster than law, when contracts replace trust, when wealth buys voice, then commerce is no longer just a function of the empire. It is the empire. By the mid-10th century, as the Abbasid Caliphate began to fragment under regional dynasties, one thing remained consistent. Ships still sailed from India to Basra. Caravans still crossed from Bukhara to Baghdad. Letters of credit still moved through merchant houses. The caliphs lost power. The generals lost provinces. But the merchants kept their ledgers open. They kept the world moving. And so we are left to ask, when the state falls silent, will the sound of coins still echo through the marketplace? Story 6. The Astronomers Who Couldn't Sleep. Night Science in Abbasid Baghdad. Long before telescopes, before observatories housed in marble domes, and centuries before modern science had a name, there were people who couldn't sleep because the stars were too loud. Baghdad in the 9th century was a city of traders and calligraphers, of markets and mosques, yes. But behind its public walls and beneath its sloping rooftops, it also became a city of numbers, stars, and unanswered questions. The Caliph at the time, Al-Mamun, was no ordinary ruler. He believed that knowledge was divine. More precisely, he believed that God's order was best reflected in the mathematical precision of the universe. And so, in a moment of political calm, he turned his attention skyward. He founded Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, a library, research center, and translation institute, but not merely for Greek texts or Persian poetry. No, Al-Mamun had another mission. He wanted to measure the earth. Not philosophically, not theologically, but geometrically. And so he summoned a group of mathematicians, geographers, and stargazers. Among them were Yahya ibn Abi Mansur, a master of astronomical tables, Al-Khwarizmi, father of algebra, and Al-Farghani, a meticulous observational astronomer. These men were not poets, they were calculators of the sky. They worked late into the night, in domed chambers lit by oil lamps, bent over instruments of their own design. Their hands were calloused not from labor, but from the edges of brass sextants, from the fine grooves of engraved astrolabes. Their goal was modest in description, but immense in scale: to determine the size of the earth using empirical observation. Hear how they did it. First, they chose a flat plain in what is now northern Iraq, the plain of Sinjar. They marked a straight meridian line using plumb bobs and rods, then measured the altitude of the sun at noon from two different locations. Using trigonometry inherited from Ptolemaic models, they calculated the arc between these 2 points. They then walked the distance between the 2 sites, literally packing the desert in sandals, counting footsteps, and measuring with knotted rope. From this, they calculated the Earth's circumference to be approximately 24,000 miles off, by only a few hundred miles. It was not a guess, it was not a metaphor. It was science. But why did they do this? Because to the scholars of the Abbasid world, understanding the heavens was practical. The stars determined prayer times. The moon governed fasting. The Qibla, the direction of prayer, required geographic certainty. Even the building of mosques and palaces demanded precise orientation. Astronomy was not idle speculation. It was devotion made measurable. And it was conducted with tools so precise, they rivaled anything built in Europe for another 400 years. Among the most common tools: astrolabes, intricate discs that could model the sky on a flat surface, used for timekeeping and navigation; quadrants, for measuring the angle of stars above the horizon; armillary spheres, metal rings modeling celestial coordinates. Some instruments were small enough to hang from a belt. Others were mounted on wood and brass, tall as a grown man, balanced carefully on packed earth. And the records, the records. Each night's observation was logged, with the exacting eye of a scribe. At the 2nd hour after sunset, Venus was observed 3 degrees north of the waxing crescent. Cloudless, moderate wind from the west, brightness estimated as magnitude -4. It was, in many ways, boring work. Stars moved slowly. Days passed with little change. Charts grew fat with repetition. But the astronomers endured because they were not just collecting data, they were building certainty, degree by careful degree. Al-Farghani, in particular, became renowned for his work on celestial spheres. His treatise Elements of Astronomy would later be translated into Latin and influence European thinkers like Dante and Copernicus. But during his own life, he worked in relative quiet mostly at night, with few students, few comforts, and no guarantees that anyone would read his notes. Yet he did it anyway. Because the Abbasid approach to science was built not on spectacle, but on accumulation. Knowledge was not a flash of genius. It was a ledger built line by line. And the stars, silent and constant, became the scholars' most faithful correspondents. There were no great revelations, no thunderclaps of discovery, only the slow turn of the heavens and the men who measured it with patient awe. And yet, even in this devotion to data, a tension remained between faith and reason, between tradition and measurement. Some theologians questioned the emphasis on Greek models, which placed Earth at the center and relied heavily on pagan cosmology. Others worried that astronomy bordered on astrology, that it might tempt scholars toward divination and determinism. The scholars answered cautiously. They emphasized utility for calendars, for prayer, for navigation. They drew sharp lines between astronomy, ilm al-Hayya, and astrology, ilm al-Nujum. But they also knew quietly that their models did more than measure. They explained. They revealed a universe ordered by logic, predictable by math, and measurable by human hands. And that more than anything was revolutionary. Not because it threatened religion, but because it suggested that God's design was intelligible, that the cosmos was not chaos but clockwork, that piety and precision could coexist. And so they kept measuring. In Baghdad, in Damascus, in Nishapur, in Samarkand. Generation after generation of sleepless astronomers took to rooftops with parchment and brass, their eyes red from smoke and fatigue, their notes covered in ink smudges and equations. Because when others slept, they watched the heavens. But what did they truly see, night after night, year after year? Was it just orbits and angles, or was there something else? A deeper question. Something the instruments couldn't answer. If the heavens are perfect and constant, what does that say about the world below? By the middle of the 9th century, the sky over Baghdad had become a library of its own. It was no longer just a ceiling of stars. It had been charted, numbered, annotated. Each constellation had a name, some from Babylonian sky lore, others borrowed from Greek manuscripts translated into Arabic. The stars had coordinates. The moon had predictable phases. The planets were no longer wandering mysteries, but points on predictive tables. And still, the astronomers were not satisfied. Because for all their charts and instruments, the celestial model itself was flawed. Inherited from Ptolemy, the model described a universe in which planets moved in epicycles, small circular orbits layered on top of larger ones to explain their apparent retrograde motion. It worked, more or less, but it was complicated, artificial. It relied on equants, geometric hacks to account for inconsistencies. For the scholars of Baghdad, this was troubling, not only because it felt inelegant, but because it violated the principle of uniform circular motion, a standard that both philosophers and theologians held dear. So a quiet rebellion began, not a loud one, not a heresy, but a scholarly one written in marginalia, in cautious treatises, in late-night debates over ink-stained scrolls. One of the most daring voices was Abu al-Hasan al-Marwazi, a mathematician and observer who worked on refining the Ptolemaic tables. He wasn't trying to overthrow the model outright, but he asked inconvenient questions. What if planetary spheres were not perfectly nested? What if motion was not uniform, but variable by proximity? What if the math doesn't fit because the heavens are not what we think? He wasn't alone. In the corridors of Beit al-Hikmah, other thinkers began sketching alternate models. Some proposed new methods of calculating lunar parallax. Others remeasured solstices, comparing their observations to earlier data. They found errors. Tiny ones, yes, a degree here, a misplaced star there, but enough to make them doubt the old certainties. The problem was not lack of evidence, it was the weight of tradition. Greek cosmology, particularly Aristotle's view of the heavens, was deeply respected, not only by scientists but by philosophers, theologians, and jurists. It fit neatly with the idea of a perfectly ordered, divine creation. Questioning it wasn't blasphemy, but it was uncomfortable. Especially because some of the most powerful patrons of science, including the caliphs themselves, saw these models as reflections of God's harmony. So the astronomers tread carefully. They proposed refinements, not revisions. They corrected errors, rather than rewriting the cosmos. And still, they could not look away from what their instruments showed. One key breakthrough came not from Baghdad, but from Ray, where al-Razi, a physician-philosopher, argued for empirical observation over received wisdom. His approach influenced others, including younger astronomers like al-Battani, who would eventually correct some of Ptolemy's figures for the solar year and the eccentricity of the Earth's orbit. But these revisions came slowly. Because unlike theology or poetry, science in the Abbasid world was a slow burn, not a bonfire. Each discovery was triple-checked. Observations were repeated across seasons. Instruments were recalibrated. Nothing was trusted unless it could be written, measured, and shared. And this required materials. Instruments were expensive. Brass astrolabes had to be etched by hand. Quadrants required careful weight balancing. Even parchment was costly, sometimes scraped and reused, leaving behind ghosts of earlier scribbles. Many astronomers shared instruments. They kept them in small observatories atop mosques, palaces, or even bathhouses, where the air was stable and the roofs flat. They observed from towers or from courtyards cleared of dust. And they wrote constantly. Observational logs, correction tables, personal notes, translations of earlier Greek texts, commentaries on Indian methods of eclipse prediction, diagrams of solar declination, lunar tracking charts, hundreds of pages, most of which have long since vanished. What survives today are fragments, burned edges of treatises, partial tables copied by students, and a handful of full manuscripts preserved by European translators in later centuries. But in their time, these documents flowed like ink into sand. And yet the scholars kept writing. They copied texts by candlelight. They compared Latin numerals to Sanskrit. They debated Aristotelian physics while adjusting gnomons under the midday sun. They even observed from prisons. One notable case was Ibn Saul, a mathematician who laid the groundwork for optics. Accused of political sedition, he was jailed for a time in Wasit but allowed to keep his scrolls. Guards reported that he spent most nights drawing light rays in the dust of his cell floor. In this, astronomy was not just about stars, it was about vision, about how we see and what we accept as true. And not everyone agreed. Some scholars, particularly those associated with more orthodox schools of theology, warned against over-reliance on human reasoning. They feared that measuring the heavens might lead to arrogance, to forgetting that all knowledge is conditional except God's. Others feared something even subtler, that science, by explaining so much, might leave no room for wonder. It's a tension that still echoes today. But the astronomers of Baghdad weren't trying to erase faith. Most were deeply religious. They saw no contradiction in measuring the stars and prostrating at dawn. For them, observation was worship. Precision was praise. The sky was God's handwriting, and they were learning to read it. Still, the doubts remained. Because for every measurement confirmed, a new inconsistency arose. Lunar eclipses occurred slightly earlier than predicted. Planetary conjunctions didn't align perfectly. The moon's size varied more than the models allowed. And yet they persisted. They didn't claim to have all the answers. They knew that models were provisional, that the heavens were not there to flatter our systems but to challenge them. So they continued observing, calculating, revising. They fought not against ignorance, but against the comfort of easy answers. And they did this not in lecture halls or public courts, but in the deep hours of the night, surrounded by dust, ink, and the soft scratching of reed pens. Because in those hours, when the city was silent and the stars were clear, it didn't matter who had funded the instruments, or which caliph approved the charts. What mattered was that the stars were still turning, and that someone somewhere was still trying to follow. Still, a question lingered unspoken but heavy in every diagram, every chart, every cautious correction. If our models must change with every new truth, how do we know when to stop? In the end, the astronomers of the Abbasid Golden Age were not chasing fame. They were chasing certainty and finding, at best, refined uncertainty. By the late 9th and early 10th centuries, many of the great names had faded into the background of history. Al-Farghani, Al-Khwarizmi, al-Battani, men whose treatises had been copied, debated, and sometimes quietly shelved in dusty libraries. New scholars had risen in their place, building on their work, refining methods, correcting the math but always looking up. The Abbasid Caliphate itself, by this point, was splintering. Baghdad was no longer the unchallenged heart of the Islamic world. The Buyids, Turks, and other regional powers increasingly asserted control. The patronage that once poured into the House of Wisdom now trickled toward military priorities, administrative repairs, and religious conservatism. And yet the stars remained, as did those few who could not ignore them. Smaller observatories emerged across the Muslim world in Cairo, Toledo, Samarkand, and Maragha in the centuries to come. Each owed a silent debt to the sleepless nights in Abbasid Baghdad, where men had sketched the first systematic attempts to describe planetary motion using empirical data, not myth. Among the last great astronomers of the Baghdad school was Ibn Yunus, working from Egypt in the 10th century. He produced a set of planetary tables so accurate that European astronomers would still refer to them 6 centuries later. He used a giant astrolabe nearly 1.4 meters in diameter and refined earlier observations with an almost obsessive precision. His legacy was not in the beauty of his prose, it was in the clarity of his numbers. But the quietest and most profound legacy of these astronomers was not in the tools they built or the tables they left behind. It was in the shift in thinking. Before them, the stars were mysterious fixed symbols of fate and divine will. After them, the stars were still mysterious, but also measurable, predictable, and subject to revision. That was new, and quietly revolutionary. It meant that the heavens, once the domain of gods, omens, and myth, were open to human understanding, if only partially and always with care. This legacy would travel westward. By the 12th century, European translators in Toledo and Sicily would begin to copy Arabic texts into Latin. They brought with them Al-Farghani's Elements of Astronomy, al-Battani's Zij al-Sabi, al-Khwarizmi's mathematical works, from which the word algorithm derives. These would lay the groundwork for later astronomers like Copernicus, Tycho Brahe, and Kepler, names now etched into Western science. Their telescopes pointed at the same stars the Abbasids once watched with oil lamps and naked eyes. And yet, the men of Baghdad rarely claimed they had discovered anything. They preferred terms like adjusted, measured again, compared with earlier tables. Their humility was not performative, it was method, it was survival. Because in their world, knowledge was sacred but also dangerous. To claim too much certainty could offend religious authority. To question ancient knowledge could alienate patrons. And yet they persisted, because they believed deeply that truth was worth the risk, even if it came only in the form of better decimals. They believed that there was virtue in slow correction. They believed that even if they could not reach the stars, they could at least describe their movement more honestly than those who came before. But perhaps the greatest testament to their work is not in what they accomplished. It's in what they accepted they never would. They understood centuries before relativity or quantum physics that certainty has limits, that the more precisely one measures, the more clearly one sees the flaws in the previous model, that knowledge is a staircase that climbs into cloud with no final landing. Their work never ended, not because it failed, but because the sky never stops changing. They passed on their instruments. They passed on their ink-stained scrolls. They passed on their questions. And even now, as we observe the stars with radio telescopes and space-based observatories, we are still trying to answer questions they first scribbled in the margins of parchment under the quiet dome of Baghdad's night. So when you look up on a clear night, far from noise, and see the stars moving slowly overhead, remember, you are watching what they watched. You are wondering what they wondered. And maybe, just maybe, you are losing sleep over the same question. If the heavens are ordered and eternal, why is the world below them so restless and short-lived?